So, stress impacts us as individuals and as organizations. And according to a Stress in America report, it contributes to 60% of all illness and disease, and it costs the nation $300 billion every year in medical bills and lost productivity. So, what are you guys seeing, and what, if anything, can leaders do about this?
I think you're spot on, Teal, with the notion that stress is personal, it's part of a person's lived experience, but it's often expressed organizationally. And the things we're learning about organizations is they are impacted by stress, but they can also be stress inducing. And as we're working with organizations and helping them assess their culture, we are constantly asking, what are you doing that heals stress as much as introducing stress? But I'm really curious to hear what the rest of you are seeing as you're working with organizations, and how is stress expressing itself?
Well, I know for the longest time, Jay and I, when we were starting the center, we kept hearing these stories of stress and burnout, especially in the staff area, where maybe not the leader so much, but the staff. And Jay would use this illustration. You tell it better than I do, Jay, about the cup being, are you coming to work with the cup already filled with stress? And so your capacity to actually do work without being overwhelmed is pretty small. What would you add to that, Jay? You demonstrate that so well with clients.
Well, I think it's easier for a typical employee to blame the employer for their stress. Nobody wants to blame their spouse, their aging parents, their children, their dog. Nobody wants to blame anything at home. It feels bad. And so it's quite often that the workplace gets blamed. And yet, interesting, Paul, you and I did an assessment of an organization recently, a pretty large organization, and we found, and they were surprised by, how much of their stress was coming from outside of work after that assessment. You remember that?
Oh, absolutely. The fact that I'm stressed does not check itself at the door when I come to work. I bring all of that with me, and all that vulnerability, all my lack of sleep, all my busy thoughts in my head, and now I have to try and perform. And it's just easy then to blame that context.
And so when I come to work, and if I'm stressed out, I have a sick child, I have marital issues, I have financial issues, all of those things chipping away at me, and I come to work, and if Billy is my supervisor and he gives me a major project, I could get really angry at him. He did absolutely nothing wrong. He gave me a project that should be within my scope of responsibility, my bandwidth, and yet I could express a lot of conflict, right, back to Billy, and he might be wondering, what did he do? He did nothing. It was really my private issues that were affecting my work performance.
And I've seen that. I was just working with somebody last year where the word contentment was a word privately that was actually impacting them in their organization. They lacked contentment privately, so they were always pursuing the next idea, the next watch, the bigger boat, the bigger house. And it actually was then having an impact on where they worked because they felt like they were always having to serve that rather than find contentment in those things. And the thing we worked on with them was like contentment actually gives freedom. And it gave them freedom. The word that I used with them was actually margin. The margin wasn't needed as much on the business side. Their margin was needed a little bit more on the personal side. But I do think as leaders, we have an opportunity to kind of drip that into the people that work with us and report to us to help them navigate some of those personal things that they may not be able to do on their own by encouraging them to look at their schedule and say, well, you're spending every weekend at your beach home or so you don't have the time to do this and you're getting home at 10 o'clock and then you're wondering why that Monday feels so stressful. You're already at a deficit.
Billy, I love that, what we can do as leaders to impact stress levels. And I think you talked about the personal side of that. On the work side, there's an article I love to use with my coaching clients that's about the benefits of clarity and both organizational and individual clarity in reducing burnout and reducing stress among the work team. And I feel like so many organizations don't have clarity around their direction. They don't have a solid strategic plan. Then individuals don't have clarity on their role and their expectations. And that just creates a lot of stress. People want to know what's expected of them, and they want to know as a team, where are we headed?
You know, we saw that we have a stress survey we do with organizations, and it bubbles up 7 different expressions of stress. Well, one of them is around job security, and we were working with an organization that had a lot of tenure, people that were not leaving, but they were expressing a lot of stress around job security. Because we were able to dig deeper with the owner of the organization, we saw it wasn't I was afraid I was going to get fired. It's just, am I performing? Do I have the feedback? And that lack of feedback, or that focus on micro tasks rather than the big picture, is just introducing stress, and I don't have that connection to performance.
Paul, tell us a little bit about that instrument. You know, we practice what we try and tell others. So when we did that, that was quite a revelation, and I don't remember instrumentation being as accurate before.
Yeah, it was really helpful, and it's an invitation to an organization, and often the leaders of an organization or an entrepreneurial leader, to look at themselves and their organization. It's hard to hear feedback from your staff that we're feeling stressed by my leadership, but that tool was really helpful, and as we cracked the door with one of the organizations, he really was able to start hearing his employees in a different way, validating them, and yet not removing the demands to perform. What was really exciting was it wasn't a once and done. We were able to then form a task force of employees across all levels to work together, to listen, to come back with solutions, and actually empower people to do things individually. The thing about stress is it can render you feeling impotent and as a victim, but as you can move into a potent problem solver, things begin to change. That tool really helped us create the language that empowered people to do that.
Yeah, I love that instrument.
I remember when we did it around here in our center team, no names mentioned, but at least one member of our team had very high stress levels. But we're not going to rat that person out. But you know, one of the things I love about this topic is, and I find in working, you know, we all work with real people with real life issues, some of whom have very serious issues, right? Whether we're in a church leadership team or a business team or an opera, nobody's immune to stress and challenges. But I also really love talking about the resiliency of people. And I feel like at times we haven't talked enough about that in culture. All we've talked about is, you know, how bad you should feel. And in a sense, we don't say, but you are resilient. You know, God makes us resilient. And a researcher out at Columbia University who actually said that the genetic makeup of human beings is to be resilient. And statistics show the far majority are, even when they go through the most difficult circumstances, they bounce back much quicker than we would ever be led to believe. And so I think it's important to say that to people, because at times they think they're going to break. And honestly, we have to be sensitive. Some people do break, but a lot of them get up the next day and they go at it again. And they wake up the next day and they go at it again. And that's resiliency.
And God has wired us that way. Our brains have plasticity and elasticity. We can learn new habits. Old dogs can learn new tricks. And one of the key pathways to that is relationship. It's not just sitting in a room alone trying to practice mental exercises. It's doing them in a relational fashion, because that external voice is often far more impactful than my internal voices. Jay, you and I have talked about the notion of chatter. All those messages that we carry around with us, some positive, some not so positive, but they all start taking place and hold in our heads. When we can start creating a different voice, God's voice, the voice of trusted friends and people who care for us, that's actually a really powerful tool.
I actually look back on that resiliency. I was in Russia. I thought I was getting on the 6-hour express train, and it ended up being the 19-hour local. And, you know, I just remember thinking, how am I going to make it through 19 hours? But you develop almost a muscle of resiliency. And one of the tools that I've personally used and I help other leaders use is to look back at how resiliency has been proved in the past, so that resiliency can be hoped for in the future. Look at how you've been resilient in this situation or this difficulty or this circumstance, this season of life. And then, I don't know if you've felt this, but people go through seasons, you know? It's not typical that you're having to be resilient for an entire life. Now, there's times when couples have a very sick child and it's just going to be the way it is. But for most people, they can actually build that resiliency muscle.
Yeah, one author actually used the seasonal metaphor for their life journey, right? Winter, spring, summer, fall. And he had really interesting insights because winter, everything feels dead. But underneath that snow and ice is actually life. And so even in the most devastating times, there's glimmers of hope and there's glimmers of a new day coming.
Yep. Some of the best coaching we can give is there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if I'm in the middle, some of the best things we can provide is a tool I was trained in called distress tolerance. And that is to say, it is real, it is present, and here are some tools that I can practice until that distress at least lessens, it doesn't go away.
You know, I love that even this very conversation, you have to have a level of vulnerability to get into this conversation with a group, especially a group of leaders. And we know all the research that's out there about how vulnerability being fundamental to building trust. And, you know, that's really key to a leadership team in particular, working together, being able to trust one another, is to being able to be vulnerable about these things. That I'm in a season where I'm feeling a lot of stress. I'm in a difficult season with other challenges. And so I just love, I think, whether it's this assessment tool or other ways that, that we can work with organizations to sort of raise these so-called softer topics. I think that vulnerability and the conversations that come out of that really strengthen a team.
And how we coach the organizations and the leaders to respond to that rather than pushing it down and just hoping it goes away. We're acknowledging it. It's not taking over our organization, but we're using that as a piece of feedback that we can now engage with our employees around and actually help them create some solutions.
Many companies offer time off for holidays, right? You have Thanksgiving off. And now I'm hearing people talk about, I'm taking a mental health day, or I'm practicing self-care, or I'm going on a sabbatical. I didn't used to hear that with such frequency. Is that a good tendency that we're seeing in organizations to offer that or use that nomenclature? Is it helping, or is it actually maybe hurting, or is there a balance there?
It's funny, I don't see that in my small business clients. I don't see a trend towards offering those things. But I will say this, I think there is something healthy to the concept of self-care. I think as we become more aware of where we are, I'm feeling stressed out, I'm feeling burned out, it's better to take some time off, if, you know, even just a long weekend or something, to recharge and rest and get a new perspective rather than trying to push through that. So I think there's something healthy about it. I just don't think every organization can offer sabbaticals and mental health.
And I would say, Gray, that, you know, I would agree with that. Probably as a case-by-case basis. Some people need a true break, right? There's something serious going on, and they could be facing some very serious consequences of that. I do think at times there's an element where people have to continue to not introspect too much. You know, we've so focused in the past, what would you say, Paul, 15 to 20 years on reflection and introspection, that they have found that that's not all good. You could actually create more stress by some of that process, not less. And so I do think sometimes just having a wise friend could be a therapist, but it could just be whatever happened to the days of just wisdom in friendship that can help you feel more normal about your circumstances, or help you get through another day, or provide a word of encouragement.
Yeah. You know, Dave, to your question, the mental health field has actually moved far more to tools and helping a person take their own temperature. Where am I in terms of my stress and other factors? But then what are the tools, what are the self-care tools that I employ so I don't have to take a mental health day? It's called a vacation. And I'm actually creating those timeouts for myself that are very positive and not moving me into that victim role, but rather an empowered person who knows how to understand where they are. So it really comes back to, can I take the temperature of my stress? Can I take the responsibility to do something about it? Now that opens the door to getting some tools. Those tools are the things that will really help me, particularly if there's relationships involved in those. And I think that's a path forward in dealing with stress.
And Paul, I like what Jay had to say there about someone who can help get perspective. And I think my executive coach used to say leaders are perspective makers. I think that's one way that we help our clients is to make perspective about the situation of stress.
Well, we had a great conversation on stress and resiliency, and nobody's going to argue whether it's ever present, right? It's certainly something we're experiencing. We're seeing it in our client organizations and the people that we coach. And we also know that there is hope available. And sometimes that could be through coaching, and sometimes that could be through counsel. But somewhere along the way, the last thing to do is nothing.